It is usually common to think of the muscle's action as either lengthening or shortening. But do you know that the muscle can be at work while not lengthening or shortening? Let's find out. I am Ofrom Chukudi and I welcome you to this interesting physical and health education class. We'll be discussing the theme, Basic Human Anatomy and Physiology in relation to physical activities. And our topic for discussion today is muscles. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify muscles involved in movement and list the types of muscle contractions. Locomotor and non-locomotor movements are essential for our survival. Locomotor movements such as running and walking, as well as non-locomotor movements which require us to move our body parts without changing location, require the action of both the muscular and skeletal system. These two systems of the body work together to achieve movement. Interestingly, a movement that may be considered as very minute may require more than one muscle before it can be achieved. Thus, it can be concluded that movement is a very complex process. As mentioned earlier, the skeleton and the muscles need to work together to achieve movement. But for this lesson, we'll be focusing on the muscles that are responsible for different levels of movement. Let's talk about those muscles. The human muscles allow the body to achieve movement at different rates and directions. To achieve movement, about 650 skeletal muscles work together. These skeletal muscles are attached to bones by special tissues called tendons. And when the muscle pulls on a tendon, it pulls on a bone, which in turn results in the movement of the connected body parts. Now, let's talk about the basic principle of movement as it relates to the muscles. For skeletal muscles to achieve movement, they always exist in pairs. That means a muscle has to initiate a movement while another muscle reverses that movement. Let's explain it better with this infographic on the board. The image on the board shows the movement of the elbow. As I said earlier, movement by a skeletal muscle always exists in pairs. A muscle initiates the primary movement, and that muscle is referred to as a prime mover, while another muscle reverses the movement, and this muscle is referred to the antagonist. For example, in the flexion of the elbow, which is an action that reduces the angle between bones of the elbow, the biceps muscle is termed the primary mover or the prime mover, and it causes the flexion action. To reverse this movement, the tricep muscle acts as the antagonist, which extends the bones that are joined in the elbow to make them look straight. Now, let's consider other common examples of muscular movement and the muscles involved in achieving these movements. The first example of muscular movement we'll talk about is the flexion and extension of the elbow. Remember, muscular movements always exist in pairs. That means a muscle initiates the primary movement while another reverses that movement. Now let's talk about the flexion and the extension of the elbow. The flexion of the elbow results in the decrease of the angle between the bones. Common way to flex your elbow is by bending it, and the muscles involved are the biceps brachii, the brachialis, and the brachiradialis. To reverse the flexed elbow, we extend the elbow. This action increases the angle between the bones and results in straightening or stretching of the hand, and the muscle involved is the triceps brachii. Another common example of muscular movement is the abduction and adduction of the hip. The abduction of the hip is moving the hip away from the body's midline, and the muscles involved are the gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, and the sartorius. In the adduction of the hip is moved towards the body's midline, as shown in the image here. And the muscles involved are the pectineus, the adductor longus, and the gracilis. Another example of muscular movement is the pronation and supination of the forearm. The pronation of the forearm involves rotating the forearm to make the palm face backward or downward. And the muscles involved are the pronator teres and the pronator quadratus. To reverse this movement, we supinate the forearm, which is rotating the forearm to make the palm face upward or forward. And the muscles involved are the supinator muscles and the bicep brachii. Next, we talk about the inversion and eversion of the foot. The inversion of the foot is turning the sole of the foot inward, while the eversion of the foot is turning the sole of the foot outward. In the inversion of the foot, the following muscles are involved: the tibialis anterior and the tibialis posterior. While in the eversion of the foot, the peroneus longus, also known as the fibularis longus, as well as the brevis and tertius, are involved in the eversion of the foot. Now let's talk about another muscular movement, which are dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. In dorsiflexion, we bring the foot upward, that the toes point towards the top. Dorsiflexion requires that we walk on our heels, and the muscle involved is the tibialis anterior. While in plantar flexion, we bring the foot downwards, that the toes point towards the floor. The muscles involved for this movement is the gastrocnemius muscle, the soleus, and the plantaris. And finally, let's talk about the elevation of the jaw as well as the depression of the jaw. Elevation basically refers to the movement of a part of the body upward, while depression of a body part involves moving that body part downward. In this case, we are talking about the elevation and depression of the jaw. To elevate the jaw, the following muscles are involved: the masseter muscle, the temporalis, and the medial pterygoid, while the lateral pterygoid is responsible for the depression of the jaw. Here are other examples of muscles involved in movement. Each muscle is involved in moving the body parts closest to it. Some of the muscles we didn't mention earlier are the pectoralis muscle, the obliques, the quadriceps, the hamstring, and many others. Now let's talk about muscle contraction. Muscle contraction is any modification of the muscle to achieve movement or maintain posture. While the term contraction may generally refer to shortening, the term muscle contraction refers more than shortening and lengthening of the muscles. In fact, the muscles may be at work while not lengthening or shortening. Let's find out as we discuss types of muscle contractions. Before we move on to discuss the different types of muscle contractions, let's talk about how we can describe muscle contraction. Muscle contractions are described based on what stays the same by the time a muscle works to achieve motion or maintain posture. Muscle contractions can be described based on the following: the length of the muscle, which is how stretched out the muscle becomes when in use; the tension in the muscles, which is the force exerted by a muscle on an object; and finally, the speed, which is the rate at which motion is produced within the muscles. Having known that, now let's talk about the different types of muscle contractions. Now let's talk about the types of muscle contraction. There are three basic types of muscle contractions, namely isotonic contractions, isometric contractions, and isokinetic contractions. Note, iso refers to equal or the same. Tonic for this lesson refers to tension. Metric refers to length, and kinetic refers to motion. With this in mind, let's talk about isotonic contractions. Isotonic contraction refers to the contraction of the muscles, during which the tension in the muscles remains the same, while the length of the muscle changes. The tension in the muscle is determined by the load a muscle is acting on. Isotonic contractions are usually used by the muscles to achieve motion, but there are two types of isotonic contractions. Let's talk briefly about each of them. There are two types of isotonic contractions, namely the concentric isotonic contraction and the eccentric isotonic contraction. In concentric isotonic contractions, there is shortening of the muscles, while the load or the tension in the muscle remains the same. A common example is when lifting an object. During the lifting action, the muscles shorten, but the load remains the same. Eccentric isotonic contractions are the direct opposite of concentric isotonic contractions. In eccentric isotonic contractions, there is lengthening or elongation of the muscle. A common example is while dropping the load. While the load remains the same, the movement results in the lengthening of the muscles. That will be all for isotonic contractions. Now let's move on to talk about isometric contractions. Another type of muscle contraction we'll be looking at is isometric contraction. In isometric contraction, the length of the muscle remains the same. This type of contraction is commonly used by the muscle to maintain posture and grip. For example, as you can see in this image, there is no movement in the muscle, causing the length of the muscle to remain the same. The hand is kept in a static position while acting on the load. Common examples of when we apply isometric contraction is grabbing an object by the hand. As you can see from this image, the hand is taking hold of this object, and there is no forward, upward, backward, or downward movement of the hands. Isometric contractions are also useful when maintaining posture. For example, as shown in this image, isometric contraction helps this man to stand erect, since he's not making any forward, backward, downward, or upward movement. Remember, in all instances of isometric contraction, there is no movement that may cause a decrease or increase in the length of the muscles. Now let's talk about the isokinetic contractions. Isokinetic contraction is an unpopular kind of muscle contraction. In isokinetic contraction, the muscles contract at constant energy and speed, during which there are changes in both the length and tension of the muscles. Isokinetic contractions can be observed when a person performs repeated movements over a stationary object. For example, running in a treadmill, as shown in the image here. So this brings us to the end of this lesson. But before we go, let's take a quick summary of what we've learned so far. First, we learned that about 650 skeletal muscles contribute to locomotor and non-locomotor voluntary movements. And lastly, we learned the three types of muscle contractions, which are isotonic contraction, isometric contraction, and isokinetic contractions. Now, let's take some questions to see how well we can remember what we've learned so far. Question 1. Which muscle is responsible for the extension of the elbow? Is it A, the biceps brachii, B, the brachialis, C, brachioradialis, or D, the triceps brachii? The correct answer is option D, the triceps brachii. Question 2. The muscular contraction in which the length of the muscle remains the same is it A, eccentric contraction, B, isotonic contraction, C, isometric contraction, or D, isokinetic contraction? The correct answer is option C, isometric contraction. This is where we draw the curtain close. I believe by now you can mention some muscles responsible for movement, as well as describe the different types of muscle contractions. We'll meet in my next class. Bye for now.